Iran has agreed to return to the negotiations with the global powers. The Western powers in the group are hoping that these talks will in some way tame Iran's nuclear ambitions. And this may seem like a familiar routine. The United States campaigns for sanctions against Iran. Israel hints at a military action. A deadline is set for the negotiations. Iran does its usual diplomatic dance, and another deadline passes and the negotiations end in a stalemate. But one interesting fact is that President Obama has made it clear that the US is working to impose crippling sanctions against Iran. This basically means preventing any major energy and shipping company to continue their gasoline trade with Iran. Despite the fact that Iran sits on some of the world's largest crude oil reserves, Iran still imports a third of its gasoline just to keep up with the domestic demand. This has to do with Iran's lack of oil refineries and growing population. So sanctions on gasoline is the Achilles heel of Iran, and it could have devastating effects on the Iranian government. And of course the Iranians know this perfectly well, and they have countermeasures as well. This is where the Russians come in. The Russians pursue their own interests, and that is to keep the United States bogged down in the Middle East, while Moscow reasserts its influence in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. So the real problem on the gasoline sanctions against Iran is Russia. And unless the United States can make concrete concessions on Eurasian politics, Russia will keep using Iran as a bargaining chip. And if you're familiar with Zbigniew Brzezinski's book, The Grand Chessboard, concessions on Eurasia will backfire in the long term. Now, to make things even more complicated, Israel understands Russia's capabilities when it comes down to Iran. And from Israeli perspective, a nuclear Iran poses a fundamental national security threat. Tel Aviv's view is better to deal with it sooner than later. What this means is that if Russia can prevent sanctions against Iran, then a military strike is the only real option. But an Israeli military strike against Iran will have to involve the United States as well. However, a military strike against Iran is not without its consequences, because the Iranians, they can retaliate by blocking the Strait of Hormuz. This is basically the gate of the Persian Gulf, and about 40% of seaborne oil passes through this narrow strait. Now, should Iran retaliate by mining the strait, it would skyrocket the price of oil, and this would lead to global inflation. Now, consider the fact that the world is already amidst an economic crisis. Rising energy prices and global inflation would truly wreak havoc on the global economy. And this is Iran's real nuclear option, if you will. So if the United States wants to impose sanctions against Iran, Washington will have to balance the interests of Moscow, Tel Aviv, and Tehran. This is what you might call a geopolitical stalemate. This was a Caspian report by me, Shivan. Thank you for watching. Ciao.